conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder. All things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sweet, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. And today's a rough one, okay? Which is kind of concerning. A lot of you requested I go over the Hello Kitty case. Now, I've heard of this here and there. I hadn't heard all the details, and my lord, is it grim. So all the trigger warnings there, from torture to hauntings. This case shocked all of Hong Kong and the world. And they called it one of the worst and most horrible sides of humanity ever seen. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this gruesome case together. So born in 1976 in Shenzhen, China, Man-yee was a troubled child. It began with her living with her parents, who decided to abandon her as a child, leaving her to end up in an all-girls orphanage in Matawai. And in the time she was there, she would never be adopted. And with an age limit set on taking care of young girls, she was sent into the world alone at the age of 15. I didn't know how to tie my shoes at 15. You know? And as expected, it was an extremely hard life living out on the streets. She experienced the worst type of things. And eventually, she would get herself into the wrong crowd and get addicted to drugs. And this habit would lead her to rely on them, as it happens with drugs. And the only way to afford said drugs is with money. Therefore, she had to get a job. And that led her into falling into desperation, which led her into Lady of the Nighting, if you know what I mean. YouTube really doesn't like me using literally any type of terminology that involves Lady of the Nighting for some reason, which I think is weird because it's a very real thing. But anyway, and eventually at 21 years old, she was able to get a job at a brothel called Romance Villa in Shamshui Po, where she would be able to pay for her addiction. So right out the gate, I mean, she started off in a terrible situation, went through another terrible situation, which was being in an orphanage, and then was kicked out onto the street at 15 years old. And not that she is the villain at any point in the story, but she is the victim. And I feel like so many victims we see of serial killers or regular killers or just people wanting to take advantage of women specifically often come from this lifestyle. And it's heartbreaking. But that is exactly what would happen to Man-yee. But anyway, she would go on to work at this brothel, and eventually she would cozy up to one of her clients, Chi-yuan, and get married to said client in 1996. And this guy was a piece of shit, okay? He was not stable at all, and to boot, he was also a drug addict. And eventually, she would give birth to a son 2 years into her relationship in November of 1998. And their relationship was not great, as you could probably guess. Both of them were addicted to drugs. They had quite a abusive relationship as well, with neighbors constantly reporting loud shouting and arguments. And the child, of course, of them doing drugs and yelling at each other would be crying and screaming, so the neighbors would constantly send noise complaints because of them. So it was a less than peaceful environment, as you can imagine. And realizing this was no place to raise her son and her habits were getting in the way of her child, she decided she wanted to turn her life around. So she quit drugs and Lady of the Nighting, two very dangerous things in her life that didn't benefit her son in any way, and decided to work at a different place. And she would eventually get a job as a hostess at a nightclub called Empress Karaoke Club. Love karaoke. And to ensure that her son was truly safe, she would leave her piece of shit, drug-addicted husband and fly solo to take care of her child. But although that she was living a much safer life now, she was not making as much money and was really struggling financially to help her baby and herself. And it wasn't until about a year later in 1997 that she became close with another one of her clients named Chan Man-lok, a 34-year-old man. And Chan was not the best person to be friends with if you were wanting to turn your life around. And Fan would begin to fall back into her old life and drug addiction. And after a while, Chan realized that they had a lot in common as well. Fan was a lady of the night and drug addict, and Chan just so happened to be a pimp and a drug dealer. So just a match match made in hell, basically. And eventually, after spending so much time with Chan, she would become very familiar with his crew as well. Particularly his two henchmen who were beneath him, named Leong Xing-cho, aged 26, and Leong Wei-loon, aged 21. And Chan wasn't just any pimp, he was a straight up gangster, okay? Being a part of the Wo Shing Wo triad, a very long-standing gang in Hong Kong. But despite the frequent business, money was still tight, and Fan was hanging out with gangsters who were throwing money like no tomorrow. And she started to become really used to that, and she just wanted more and more money. But the next thing that she would do would change her life entirely, and it would change her life for the worst. So on one of their drug binges in 1999, Fan stole Chan's wallet with 4,000 Hong Kong dollars in it, which is about $500 USD. And she would do this because she was struggling with money, and with these guys throwing money at her constantly, she was starting to get used to having a little bit more money, and she was so desperate to have more money that she thought that this was some sort of solution, but it just made things so much worse. And Chan, of course, would find out that he was $500 or 4,000 Hong Kong dollars short, obviously. And the only person who he could blame was the girl that he was drug binging with, and the only person that he was around when the money had disappeared. Fan. So he would then send his goons to contact her, stating that she needed to pay the money back. Which, I mean, she did steal the money, and paying him back, I mean, that's fine, that's all civil, nothing necessarily wrong there. The only wrong thing is that she stole money, but it gets worse than that. Because since she went behind Chan's back and stole his money, he kind of wanted to make an example of her. So he said, you know what, you also need to pay a fee of 10,000 Hong Kong dollars, around 1,300 USD, which is more than double than what she stole. And this was considered interest for stealing his money, basically. And the intention behind that, not only making an example of her, was that now he could force her to work under him to pay off this debt. And this amount of money to recuperate would take a very long time for Fan, especially if she was pooling it into her child and drug habits. So she would eventually pay that initial $500 or 4,000 Hong Kong dollars back to Chan, but the rest would take a long time, and Chan was getting impatient. Obviously, Chan wanted Fan to learn a lesson. The lesson being not to steal from someone who has been so gracious to you and who also had a reputation to uphold as well. Therefore, Chan would send his two henchmen, Leong Wei-loon and Leong Xing-cho, to her flat, which was located in Laiyu Estate on March 17th, 1999. However, it wasn't just the two goons that Chan would send to grab Fan, but also a 14-year-old girl named Ah Feng, who will be important later in the story. So they would take Fan from her apartment and take her to a different apartment on number 31 Granville Road, Shim Sal Sui. And this was a very large apartment complex with over 5 bedrooms. And it was rented by Chan, not owned. However, he had full access to it due to his rent. And the original idea was to teach Fan a lesson, forcing her to work completely under Chan until he was satisfied, pimping her out to any man who would have her. However, before she could get back to work, they would begin to torture her. And this is where all the trigger warnings apply, so just a heads up. Chan, like I said, had changed his mind in getting her to be a lady of the night for him, believing he should make an example of any of the girls who dare cross him. Therefore, she would instead be tortured in this abandoned building, muffling her screams with a dirty rag. And her torture was absolutely brutal. Like, there is a special dark place in hell for the people that did this to her. And it ranged from physical to psychological abuse to eventual SA. So supposedly she was beaten with metal bars until her bones were all fractured. And she would also be tied up with metal wires that dug into her skin, and they would continually beat her all through the day and all through the night, just taking turns. And the torture would just progressively get worse and worse. These people were incredibly sadistic and would just experiment essentially on her in different ways to torture her. She would be strangled with a metal wire until she couldn't breathe. They would whip her as well, and she would often dive in and out of consciousness throughout these ordeals, with the pain just being so severe. And to ensure the pain was even worse, these pieces of shit would put chili powder into her open wounds, just to make it hurt more, just because they're spawns of Satan. They would use other torture methods as well, such as burning her with lighters, and even on one occasion, Chan forced Fan to eat his own feces. Are you okay? I mean, nobody's okay. None of this is okay. But like this poor girl. Like, so awful. But in short, all of the people that were involved with Chan would take part in this torture against Fan. And the young girl, the 14-year-old La Mingfeng, known as Ah Feng as a pseudonym, would also reportedly take part in the torture towards Fan. Now, just a little bit about Ah Feng. She was one of the girls that was currently being groomed by Chan. So, I mean, in this situation, I'm going to safely assume she didn't really have a choice. She sees another woman that went against this person that she's with. Also, she doesn't want to be going through that. So she was, I'm going to safely assume, forced to go through this. Just awful. And on one occasion, she would recollect seeing Chan kick Fan in the head over 50 times. And Ah Feng then also kicked her in the head, like joining in essentially. And during all of this, just all of this horrible pain and suffering, Fan was forced to say she enjoyed it the whole time. And they would say that she had to say this in order for it to stop, but they would often just continue to do it and torture her anyway, and in more severe ways. And eventually, as you can expect, Fan did succumb to her torture, surviving around a month of continuous torture on either April 14th or April 15th, 1999. That is the day that she died. And this would spark an argument between them, believing that one of the torturers didn't watch over her hard enough, and that she probably got access to methamphetamine to overdose on it, which again, we don't know for sure. Either way, they now had a corpse that they needed to get rid of, and they had a sinister idea of how to do that. Just more trigger warnings of getting rid of a body. Just putting it out there. So they decided they needed to get rid of this body. So they would drag Fan's body to an empty bathtub. They would then grab a hacksaw and begin to cut her up into small pieces, therefore making it easier not only to relocate, but also get rid of. However, you can't just throw a body in the trash. The smell will lead others to investigate and throw off their entire operation. So they decided to do something else. They would boil each body part 2 at a time in a big pot. And by boiling the body, it would kill the DNA and germs and be easier to get rid of, leaving little trace. And this pot and stove that they boiled Fan's body on was the same place that they would cook food that they would eat as well, which is just sickening. But their sadistic thoughts somehow did not end there, because they had extra plans for her head specifically. So due to boiling body parts, most of the time everything would fall off the bone, leaving just the bone exposed essentially. So after the head was completely boiled, they would take the skull and do something completely unthinkable. Supposedly, the home was decorated with a decent amount of Hello Kitty memorabilia. So these insane instead of throwing out the head, would take the skull of Fan and grab a Hello Kitty mermaid doll and remove the Hello Kitty mermaid doll's head, and then stuff Fan's skull inside the doll and sew it back onto the Hello Kitty mermaid's body. So Fan's skull was now inside the Hello Kitty mermaid doll. And they would just set it back on the shelf like nothing ever happened. And this is where the story of the name of this case comes from. So a few weeks would go by after this whole up event, and they seem to have gotten away with their crime. However, the child in our story, the 14-year-old child, Ah Feng, felt different from what she had experienced and felt urged to go to the police. Now, why, do you ask, would she just randomly decide to go to the police, especially with the danger of Chan finding out anything, you know? But it was because she experienced some paranormal activity. On May 24th, 1999, Ah Feng would go to the police and tell them that she had been haunted for days and nights, even in her dreams, by a woman who was bound with electrical wire and who was tortured to death. sound familiar? And the police would just blow her off, thinking that she was just a teenager with a very descriptive imagination, and they wouldn't think anything of it. However, she would clarify that this ghostly presence she was feeling was due to her involvement in the murder of this exact woman that was currently haunting her. That'll do it. And willing to show them everything that had happened, she would do so if, in exchange, she was granted protection. So again, that just kind of coincides with she was just afraid that entire time that she was living in under Chan, which is, again, just so incredibly sad. And she would then begin to describe everything that happened, everything that we already spoke about. And completely shocked, the police would get up and immediately go run down to the flat, to which a Hello Kitty doll was sitting on the bed. And inside the Hello Kitty doll, the police would find a skull and a ton of rotting insects as well. And all that was left of Fan was a few teeth and a fridge with internal organs stuffed in it as well, and the skull that was retrieved from the doll. And the apartment and living conditions she was left in were disgusting and absolutely mortifying. Trash was left all over the floor, and it was just a decrepit place. So the police would try to be swift with their arrests, knowing how serious this crime was and his connection to the triads. The arrest was an absolute must. And Chan was just living it up, absolutely clueless to the events that were about to transpire. He would be at his home with his wife, spending quality time with a newborn child. Just letting that sink in. And that is when a SWAT raid team would come in early morning on May 28th and rip his dumb bitch ass out of there. And this arrest would be announced in the news and the paper, and Liang Weilun fled to mainland China before he could be arrested as well. However, he would be later caught by police on the 14th of February 2000, after irregularities in his passport were found. And he would then be sent back to Hong Kong for the 17th of February trial. And the Yongqing Cho was put on Interpol's most wanted list, so he was sent back to Hong Kong as well, to bring justice to Fan Man-yee, finally. So on October 20th, 2000, the trial would finally begin. Ah Fong would testify in this trial in exchange for her immunity. And during this trial, Chan and his accomplices denied intending to kill Fan. Okay, stating that they were just meaning to rough her up. Tell you what, you come over to my place, I'll rough you up, all right? However, they did not deny the fact that they dismembered her body in such a sadistic way and also hid the remains. Make it make sense, you know? Chan would be the one to cut off Fan's head, they would later learn. And Ah Fong would admit more to help the case. She stated that after they found her deceased corpse, they would beat it before intending to dismember it. Why? For what? And the court was obviously fucking mortified, and the prosecutor describing it as one of the worst cases in Hong Kong's history. And the defendants' faces, while the crimes were stated, showed a complete lack of remorse, especially from Chan, who was just stone-faced the entire time, just punchable-faced the entire time. And apparently, during the trial, Liang Weilun's sister experienced a mental breakdown, and his brother would smash and break a court door when the guilty verdict was called. And unfortunately, they were only charged with manslaughter and unlawful imprisonment. Make it make sense. So they were charged with life imprisonment, somehow with the possibility of parole. And then the men who were examined at Castle Peak Hospital and Sulam Hospital described the trio of men as remorseless, even though the court had not learned of a case as depraved, brutal, and vicious. And what's absolutely mind-boggling to me is that Liang Cho was actually let out early in 2011 despite being sentenced to life. And after his 18 years, he was completely freed. However, he was then charged again and put in jail in 2022 for indecently assaulting a 10-year-old girl for 12 months. Don't let monsters out of jail, because monsters remain monsters. And the media was obviously shocked, to say the least, horrified that there were people so cruel in the world, let alone in their backyard. And they were glad that the vermin, at the time at least, were off the street and locked away from the public. And TVB reporters themselves even felt sick, describing the trial as crazy and scary. And many articles have been written about this, but many have been lost in time. However, 2 movies would be made about the case. One called Human Pork Chop, which... no words, basically. And another called There Is a Secret in My Soup. The titles alone are tone deaf and terrible, but I mean, this is from a different time, from a completely different place where I'm from, so I don't have a lot to say about that. But if they're anything like what actually happened, I'm sure they're extremely horrifying and brutal. Even the movie art for the cover alone is pretty horrifying. But the aftermath of all of this finally let Fan have her rest. Thank God. And the rest of her corpse was burned and cremated on March 26, 2000. And the apartment building now linked with this horrifying murder was eventually demolished in September of 2012 and has since been rebuilt into a hotel named SourBoys, I'm not sure, in 2016. And it's still heavily debated whether these people got what they deserved. I don't think they did, but no doubt if this was committed today, there would have been a lot more serious of a punishment, at least I hope. However, what we can all agree on is that this murder was completely brutal. And all that's left to remember Fan by is this story and also a necklace that was found at the apartment where she died in that was actually given to her son after the fact. So at least he's able to have something from his mom. But man, this case broke me pretty good. Just the brutality and inhuman people involved. It's hard to wrap my head around. I mean, I know I talk about a lot of these cases and can remain, you know, somewhat stoic, but this one was hard to get through. Anyway, I just want to say thank you for watching the video. If you have any other cases you want me to go over, let me know down below. Anything from crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, murder, whatever, paranormal, anything down below, I would love to read. The reason why I did this video is because so many of you suggested it. But yeah, until next time, I will see your beautiful face in the next video. All right, bye.